Hey, hello, Cherie Louise Turner here. I'm the host and producer of Women's Running Stories, and I love a good night's sleep. I know it helps with my recovery, and it helps me to have great energy all day long. And the people at Lagoon know this too, and that is why they make terrific pillows. And they are offering listeners of Women's Running Stories 15% off on your first purchase. Just go to lagoonsleep.com and use the code WRS15 at checkout for 15% off your first purchase. Before you order, you're going to take a short sleep quiz to find out which of their pillows is best for you. I sleep on the Fox, and I love the fact that these pillows come with extra fill so you can add or remove fill as you like, making your pillow customizable. My Lagoon pillow is soft and it's comfortable and it has a nice weight to it. Of course, Lagoon makes their pillows with quality materials so you know they will last. Go on over to lagoonsleep.com and find the pillow that's right for you. That's lagoonsleep.com. Use the promo code WRS15 at checkout for 15% off your first purchase. All right, now on to the episode. You are listening to Women's Running Stories, where exceptional women runners share inspirational stories about their running experiences.
Hi, I am Vicki Hunter. I am a 63-year-old runner who lives in Boulder, Colorado, and also Kona, Hawaii. Lucky enough to live there half the year. I am a mother. I am a wife. I am a foundation training instructor. And I also love to help people get out of pain and find better movement. And that's what I am devoting my life to nowadays. And I also still run marathons and love to compete.
Yes, in this episode, you are going to hear the running story of Vicki Hunter. Running has been a steady presence in Vicki's life since she was a young teen, and she's going to get into the many ways that her relationship to the sport has changed over the years and seen her through the ups and downs of life. And there have been some very big moments. But before we hear more from Vicki, I want to welcome you to Women's Running Stories. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of this podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Vicki's story it's beautiful. Vicki's story it's beautiful. There's difficulty. There's wisdom. There's wisdom. She has insightful thought. She has thoughtful insights to share. She has thoughtful insights to share as she looks back over decades of running experience. So yeah, I'm really excited that you're here to listen. And another podcast that I also know that you will want to listen to is Unexpected Curves. It is hosted and produced by Olympian and professional runner Mariel Hall, and it is the weekly sports show that gives the girls some support. Every week, Mariel and her guest dive in to a new topic that has to do with the culture surrounding women in sport. And to do that, Mariel talks to athletes and experts to learn how their work impacts our world of play. As Mariel says, she takes a lot of left-hand turns to get to the right answers. And it's true, the show lives up to its name of delivering content that is unexpected. Mariel really has a unique way of approaching women's sports, and she has great guests. She's also a thoughtful, terrific interviewer, and I just love this show. In addition to great interviews, her introductions they're just so wonderful to listen to. So go give Unexpected Curves a listen. I will provide a link to Unexpected Curves in the show notes. So yeah, go give a listen, subscribe. I know that you will really love it. So on to Vicki Hunter's story. She tells her story so completely in this episode that there really isn't much for me to tell you before she gets started. One thing to note, though, is that Vicki's running story is embedded into her memoir that recently came out. It's called Running and Returning: Seeking Balance in an Imperfect World. Of course, I will have a link to how you can find that in the show notes. And it takes a deep, personal, raw dive into her life. It is a really honest, thoughtful memoir. All right. So let's get into Vicki Hunter's running story here on the podcast. And Vicki is going to start her story at the beginning when she first discovered running. Here to tell her running story is Vicki Hunter.
When I was a kid, I grew up in a suburban area outside of Philadelphia in a very, what I would call normal, I had a normal childhood. My parents were very encouraging of everything I wanted to do. And my mom, especially, we were kind of pushed out the door to be active from the time I could remember. So I was always a very active kid. And running wasn't something that I did competitively until much later in my life. But when I was young, I just remember always running around the neighborhood, meeting my friends to play, and we were always playing games. And then I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And when my parents got split up when I was about 10. And right around that time, my dad got caught up in the jogging craze that was started by Frank Shorter winning the gold medal in the Olympics. And my dad started jogging. And I thought, wow, this is something I want to do because he was doing it. So it gave me time with him since he wasn't living with us anymore. So I started jogging when I was pretty young. I mean, I would say I was like 12 or 13. And my competitive juices were starting to flow. I was playing competitive tennis. I was playing sports in school, but running resonated with me in a different way. And I think part of it was because my parents had split up, running was the thing that made me calmer. It kind of was my own place and time to deal with some of the emotions I was having from my parents splitting up. So when I was entering high school, I was playing actually competitive sports. I was playing lacrosse was the sport that I really gravitated towards and was doing competitive sports in school, but running was my own private thing. And I found myself needing to do that almost every day. And of course I was in after school sports. So the only time I could do it was in the morning. So I was getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning before school and running around my neighborhood without, it was dark. I remember so many times I would get up, it was dark. I would tiptoe down my stairs in my house. I was on the third floor, my bedroom, and my mom was on the second floor, and she liked to sleep. So I did not want to wake her up. So I would tiptoe down the stairs and sneak out the door because I don't even know if she knew I was doing this. And I would run around the neighborhood. I had about a 2-mile loop that I would do before I'd have to leave for school at about 6:30 in the morning. And so that was something I just started doing when I was in high school. And that morning routine of running stayed with me until now. I mean, I still am a morning runner. And I think I can't imagine doing it any other way. But it always started off my day really well. And I always would get to school and I had this feeling. It was really interesting because I think back on this. The feeling of satisfaction I had from doing those morning runs was so deep and satisfying to me. I would walk around the school, the hallways, and I would think, wow, I've already run. I've already accomplished something in this early part of the day. And so I felt this sense of accomplishment that carried with me for the rest of my life. I mean, running is always the kind of thing that I do it and I think, well, I've done something with my day so far. And it gave me this feeling of confidence and accomplishment. So that's kind of how I started running. It was one of those things that because my father was running, I wanted to run with him, but also it gave me such a sense of satisfaction. And the other piece about it is it really gave me a sense of control. I think I felt so out of control in the rest of my life, partly because my parents weren't very happy. And I think the feeling that I could make myself feel better when I could see that my parents were somehow struggling with their own well-being, and running made me feel good. So that's why I was doing it and continued to do it. When I first started running, a lot of it came from the fact that my mother was depressed. And so when I was young, and my mother slept a lot when I was a kid, and I never really understood that because I was young, but I remember her sleeping much of my childhood. And I'd wake up in the morning, she'd be asleep. Sometimes I'd get home in the afternoon and she'd be asleep. I always knew I had to be quiet to not wake her up. And when I started running and it made me feel so good, I can remember being very young and saying to myself, I don't want to feel the way my mother feels, and running makes me feel good, so I'm going to keep doing this. So at first, running had nothing to do with competitive, anything about competition. It just simply made me feel good. It alleviated some of the anxiety I had around my mother's depression. And that was how my running career started. Running, I don't even want to call it a career, but my running life started because it simply made me feel good physically and emotionally. When I went to college, and I was still playing lacrosse. Lacrosse was my high school sport, and I played in college. So playing a college sport is very demanding for anyone who has played a college sport. You have practice after classes, and you're doing other kinds of training to stay fit. And running for me was still something I was going to do no matter how much training I had to do for lacrosse. So I was still getting up every morning and running, even if I had a lacrosse game or if I had, practice, I was still going to go run. And what I found is I was so compelled to run because of how it made me feel that even if I had slight injuries or I was fatigued, I would run right through that. I mean, it was almost subconscious, or I never thought about it. I just knew there was something in me that was pushing me to run no matter what. And that went into my 20s. I mean, I really had this, I don't know if addiction is the right word, because it was more of a compulsion. I just had to do it because of how it made me feel. And there wasn't much contemplation around that. It was just, I have to do this. And when I went in my college, where I went was Mount Holyoke, and they had these winter semesters. It was just the month of January, and you could do any kind of internship. There were all these different things you could do to get credit for that January term. And so one winter, I went to a farm in Western Pennsylvania, and it was a sheep farm. It was an incredible experience. It was freezing cold. I mean, when I say cold, it was, I think, never got above 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And I was still going to run. I mean, to me, there was no question. And I remember telling the owner of the farm, it was this old, well, she wasn't probably old at the time. To me, she seemed old. She was probably in her 50s. She owned the sheep farm. Her name was June. And when I first got there, I told her, I'm going to run every morning. And she looked at me like I was insane. She said, do you know how much work we have to do on the farm every day? But she didn't. She kind of just shook her head and said, okay, whatever. Well, I was getting up every morning to run no matter what. And I was bundling up. Of course, there were no technical clothes back then. This was I think it was 1979, maybe 1980. And I was wearing these old gray sweatpants and some heavy sweatshirt and going out and running in the early dawn. It was barely light out. And I remember looking back on my journal, and I have these entries that say, well, my knee hurt, but I still went out and ran. So I was having this knee pain that whole month, but it did not stop me from going out and kind of hobbling through my 2 or 3 mile run every morning because I needed to do it. And there was something in me. And again, it had nothing to do with the physical. I don't want, maybe not nothing to do with the physical part of it, but it was more this feeling of anxiety I had that if I didn't run, I was not going to be okay. And I don't know where that came from, except I had this emotional need to run or prove to myself that I could run. And it settled me in a way that nothing else did. That's the only way I can describe it. It was like a settling of my nervous system that happened when I got out for that 2 or 3 mile run. And I think that is something that running does for us. That continuous motion is something that is very calming to the nervous system. And I think I still feel that to this day, but now I think I have a better understanding of that it's not necessary to run through injuries. I've definitely gotten to that point where I don't run through injuries anymore because I understand after, 40 years since that time that it doesn't serve us and it doesn't serve me to run through a physical injury. And I have other ways of calming myself. At the time when I was 20, running was really the only tool I had to calm that anxious part of myself. So it did in some ways become an addiction that I had to work through. And it took many years to work through that, but I did. And I think I've found other mechanisms to figure out how to calm myself and also feel good about myself. It's not just running anymore. But that is at the time when I was 20 and living on the sheep farm in Western Pennsylvania, the only way I knew of how to make myself feel okay was to go out for that run. So I've always been competitive. I mean, that's just who I am from when I was 5 and I had to win at tetherball in my backyard and beat everyone in the neighborhood. That was just, I was very driven from a very young age. And running, although it started out to not be a competitive outlet for me, because I had all these other ways to let my competitive urges come out, which was mostly lacrosse in high school and college. After college, I no longer had those team sports to live out my competitive drive. And I was still running. I mean, I always ran. From the time I was 14, I would say 13 or 14, I was always running. But again, it was never competitive. I didn't run on the cross country team in high school. I didn't run track. I didn't do any of that. And again, in college, I would play lacrosse. When I went to graduate school, I went to graduate school in Boulder, Colorado. And Boulder, Colorado is just a hotbed of competitive runners. And at the time, this was the mid 80s, and there were a lot of Olympic marathoners living here, a lot of professional runners. And somehow I got to know some of them. And at the time, I was not at all a competitive runner. I had probably done a couple 10Ks. I actually did my first marathon in 1984, but really it was just about completing that marathon. It was in Honolulu. I'd been living in Hawaii for a couple years, and I just ran this marathon just to finish it. And literally that's all I did. I mean, I ran a little over 4 hours, and I thought, well, I was happy with that, but I didn't have any aspirations to run faster. But my first year living in Colorado, I'm meeting all these Olympic athletes, and I met this one gentleman who I actually ended up getting into a relationship with, and he was a massage therapist, and he worked on all these athletes, right? So he worked on Rob DiCostella, who was a Boston Marathon winner. He worked on Lorraine Mahler from New Zealand, who went on to win the bronze medal in the Olympics in 1992. And these people became my friends and mentors. And so I saw how they were training, and I thought, wow, this is cool. But again, no aspirations to be anywhere at their level. Being a professional runner was the furthest thing from my mind that I could ever think of. Because when I was growing up, that was just not something women even could think about doing. And not that I had the talent to do it anyway, but it wasn't something that was on my radar. But this particular gentleman mentioned to me, what do you think about trying to qualify for the Olympic trials in the marathon? And I didn't even know what the Olympic trials were. Don't forget, 1984 was the first time the women even got to compete in the marathon in the Olympics. And that was the year Joan Benoit won. And I knew about Joan Benoit. I mean, certainly she was a heroine of mine. I mean, I looked up to her to no end. But the marathon was such a foreign thing to me. Or it was just an elusive thing to me. I mean, I finished one marathon, but I still didn't think it was anything that I could be competitive at. But he mentioned these Olympic trials to me, and I thought, what does that mean? And he said, well, you have to run under 2 hours and 50 minutes. And again, I looked at him like he had horns coming out of his head, because I thought, that is something that there is no way I could ever do that. But he believed in me, and for some reason I thought, well, I have nothing to lose in trying. So I did start training, and I just started increasing my mileage. And again, I was looking at all these Olympic marathoners around me, and I found myself going to the track when they were at the track and doing workouts that kind of mimicked what they were doing, but again, nowhere near the pace that they were doing. But over the next year and a half, I just started slowly getting faster. And again, not thinking that I could really accomplish this goal. But the more I did, and the more I hung around these people, I thought, well, it is worth giving it a shot. And I was competitive, so I kept working at it, and I worked my mileage up to, I actually at one point was running 130 miles a week. And that was the one thing I was good at. I could do a lot of mileage and somehow not get injured. The faster paces, though, that's where I probably started feeling a little bit more challenges, but I gradually increased the mileage, and at a certain point, I was able to start winning some local 10Ks and 5Ks and be a little bit more competitive at that local level, and found myself going to the 1987 Twin Cities Marathon to try and accomplish this goal of running under 250. And sure enough, this was my third marathon. I had run 4:09 in Honolulu in 1984. I did the Denver Marathon in the spring of 1986, and I ran 3:50. And in that marathon, I got totally injured, or I was injured going into it, and I stupidly finished the marathon. I mean, that was one of the dumber things I've done in my life, because I ended up with a knee the size of a grapefruit, and I couldn't run for a month after that. But after that, and I recovered from that marathon, was when I started building up my mileage to try and qualify for the trials. And sure enough, at the 1987 Twin Cities Marathon, I ran 2:49. And it was a miracle to me that I could do that. But it did shift my mindset. And all of a sudden, running was not just this thing I was doing for my emotional well-being. It became my competitive outlet. And winning races and being competitive at races became something that really became very important to me, and something that was a driving force. And for the next 10 years or so, I competed at a fairly high level, at least locally. And I never got faster than 2:49, but I did run several marathons around that 2:50 time. I even won a couple bigger races. I won the Taylor Wineglass Marathon, I believe is what it's called. I don't know if it's still called that, but it was in upstate New York. And I won that in 1990, I believe it was. And that was, exciting for me to win a marathon outright. So that piece of running became the driving force for me for many years. And what I realized at a certain point is that it was really feeding my ego. And I somehow, I don't know, I lost sight of what running initially meant to me, which was just this really a place of peace and a place of joy. And there was a point where I kind of lost that, which was hard for me to reconcile for a while because to me, running is such a pure sport, and it's something that everyone can do, and it shouldn't just be about winning or placing. That's just not, I think that just loses the essence of what it's about. And it loses the connectiveness that running can bring to us. I think it should be more about community and about sharing the experience with other people. And yes, I'm still competitive. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love to race, but it's not the only thing about running that I love. And for several years, that got buried in this competitive, ego driven part of me that was seeking out just those strokes that I was getting from winning races. And the fact that I was able to do that, I mean, I'm still proud of all the accomplishments I've achieved in my running life, but it's just not what's the most important thing. So when I achieved qualifying for the Olympic trials and I ran 2:49, it was very exciting, but it was also wrapped up in a negative event in my life or negative situation. I was involved in a relationship that was somewhat emotionally abusive, and the coach and gentleman who actually was the one who even started my drive towards trying to qualify for the trials. I was in a relationship with him for 3 years. He was my coach, he was my mentor, but it got kind of complicated. And I think the fact that our relationship was so tied into my running became not a good thing. So I finally got out of that relationship after 3 years. And I still appreciate everything he did for me in terms of my confidence around running. And he definitely, I think without him, I don't know that I could have ever run under 250. But emotionally, I had to get out of that relationship. And once I did, I realized that just trying to achieve faster times on the road was not satisfying to me, and it actually was kind of beating me down. So I switched over to trail running around that time, and I had a ton of friends in Boulder who were involved in ultras and running on trails for miles and miles and miles. And to me, this was something exciting. It was new. We'd go up into the high country and run these high peaks. And it was just such pure joy and fun because it was just about going out in the mountains and being with my friends all day long and exploring different places. And it had little to do with how fast I could run. But because I had been marathon trained and I was fairly fit at the time, I was fairly fast. So I started running some trail runs, and one of the first big races I did was the Pikes Peak Marathon. And I didn't even know what the Pikes Peak Marathon was until these friends told me about it. And basically, if you don't know, it's running to the top of Pikes Peak, which is a 14,000 foot peak down near Colorado Springs. And the first year I did it, I just ran. It was such joy and such effortlessness. And I got to the top, and the first year I just did the ascent. There's two races. One goes just to the top and on the first day of the weekend, and the second day people run to the top and back down, which I thought was crazy at the time. But when I did the first time I did the ascent, I ended up being the third woman to the top, and it didn't even feel like any effort. It was just like I was floating up that mountain, and I was so excited about that. And again, I had no idea that I even could do that, but I continued to run that race for many, many years, which I'll get back to. But as a result, I just started doing more and more ultras. And one of the first ones I also did was a 50K that was down in down towards southern Colorado, and it was a 50K in the Colorado Waterton Canyon, which is just outside of Denver. It's actually not that far. But again, it was such a new experience to me to run 50 kilometers because the Pikes Peak ascent is really only a half marathon. Doing 50K, which was 31 miles, was a whole new experience. And that was also just, I can't say there was no effort. Anytime you run that many miles, it is effort, but it really came fairly easy to me. And I thought, wow, I just love this. And so it ignited again this joy that I found in running. And it was like rediscovering why I originally started running. And the more miles I did, the more I loved it. So running in the trails became my kind of a second chance at experiencing running in a different way from just trying to run faster and faster. It was about being out on trails. It was being out in nature. It was being with friends. And I happened to be fairly competitive, so that was fun too. I can't say I minded winning these races. It was really fun. And it definitely probably fed it a little bit as well. It fed that joy. You know, when you come away with a win, there's no denying that makes it more fun. But again, what happened is I kind of got into this spiral of having to win or having to at least place high. And that became a driving force for me. So, and that was true for a long, long time. I mean, where running just was caught up, my running was caught up in my ego. And each time I went out to race, I think I felt like I had to prove something. And I don't know if I was trying to prove something to myself or to other people. You know, I can't even say that I'm that clear about where that was coming from. Probably some of it went back to trying to prove something to my mother because my mom never loved my running. But I thought if I won, maybe she would see, that it was worthwhile. And I think going into my subconscious and kind of some of the driving force I had probably goes back to my relationship with her, if I have to be honest about that. So I continued to compete and drive myself pretty hard in the ultra world and trail running world. And at the same time, I was in my early 30s, and part of my drive was that I wanted to have children, and I was actively seeking out a man that I might be able to have children with. And I was fortunate enough, I dated many men, but I was fortunate enough to meet my now husband when I was about 34, and he was also an endurance athlete. And one of the first dates we went on, I'm going to call it a date, but it was actually, we traveled to run the Superior Trail 50-mile race together. And truly, this was in the first couple months of our relationship. And we went to this race and we both won, which was exciting. And also probably should have been a little bit of a warning sign to me of here I am getting involved with someone who is equally as competitive and driven as I am. And I'm not sure, how good that is for a relationship, but we did support each other and we still do to this day. But it was kind of the nature of our relationship. We were always going, always competing, always seeking out an adventure. And this is awesome. And what happened was we got married and we went on a trip for our honeymoon. We can call it our honeymoon. It wasn't really a honeymoon because he was going to do the German Ironman and I was going along to support him. And we went with another couple and we went, and this was in July of the year we got married. And I was feeling a little funny on this trip. And I couldn't figure out why. I just thought, is it jet lag? What is going on? Well, lo and behold, we get home from this trip and I'm still feeling really funny. And I'm like, I can't quite figure out what's going on. And I thought, well, maybe I should take a pregnancy test. I mean, I couldn't imagine that I was pregnant already, but sure enough, I was. And this was just shortly after we had gotten married. But it did not stop me from doing anything I normally did. So I was still running. I wasn't running ultra runs, but I was still going out and running. And he and I went to Master Swim a lot together. And I was doing my regular routine, and I'm still working at the same time. So one day I'm going to work, and I leave early in the morning to go to Master Swim before I go to work for the whole day. And that evening we had an event to go to in town, and we had both driven to Boulder separately because he had to go to work and I had to go to work. And we're at this event, and I'm about 14 weeks pregnant. I have morning sickness, so nothing is appealing to me in terms of food. And they didn't even have that much food at this event. So I turned to my husband at one point. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening. And I said, I'm tired. I'm just going to go home and get some food, and I'll see you at home. So he walked me to my car. And at the time, we lived up in the mountains above Boulder. We lived off a road called Magnolia Road. It's kind of a famous road for a lot of runners coming to town, and they train up there. It's about 9,000 feet. And he walked me in my car, said goodbye. And that is really the last thing I remember, because the next morning I woke up in the hospital. I had been in a horrific car accident at the top of this mountain. No other cars were involved, but apparently I passed out at the wheel, and my car spun out and went off into a field and hit a tree on the right side of the car, and it basically smashed into my body, and I broke almost every bone on the right side of my body, and along with other injuries, including 3 skull fractures, resulting in brain injury. I had a collapsed lung. I had a punctured liver. I had a broken sacrum. I mean, I was a wreck. And here I am 14 weeks pregnant. So that accident was truly life-changing. The first 48 hours were pretty critical. I was in intensive care for 2.5 weeks, but I did survive, and my baby did survive. And she just turned 26 this year. And the recovery from that accident was like nothing I've ever been through or hope to go through again. But what I did realize during that recovery is that I am pretty focused and disciplined. And I basically treated the recovery like I was getting ready for a race. So the race was getting to my delivery day and being able to have that baby. But it really was, it was a battle in so many ways. Part of it was that I had this brain injury. So for about 3 months, everything was fuzzy. Everything was like, nothing was clear, which might have been a blessing in disguise, because I think, although I knew I was pregnant and I knew I had been in this car accident, everything was just, I was kind of in a fog. And all I thought about every day was what I could do to get better. And I woke up every day with a plan. Okay, so, today I'm going to just walk. First few days, it was like getting around the nurse's station, trying to walk on my own. I was in a wheelchair for several weeks, but I would try and walk, 100 yards. And going from being a marathon runner to just try and walk 100 yards is quite humbling. But I knew I had to just take it one day at a time. There was no other option. And I became very methodical about my recovery. And it was going to be a day-by-day thing. Each day I was going to do a little bit more. If the first day I couldn't get around the nurse's station, then the next day I was going to get around that nurse's station. When I got out of the hospital, in the first few days, if I couldn't walk up my driveway, I was going to get to the point where I could walk up my driveway. I kept setting little goals for myself. And I think that was how I got through it. It was just setting intermediate goals to the ultimate goal of being able to deliver that a healthy baby. And it's just basically how my mind works. I think I'm very goal oriented anyway. So setting intermediate goals is how I accomplish things. And instead of looking at something like, oh, one big, event, like even when it comes to training for marathons, I try not to think just about having to run 26 miles because it's daunting, right? That happens to be the distance that I am now back to training for. It's very daunting when you think about it as one big thing. But if you think about the little pieces that go into that, it makes it more doable. So that's how I approached coming back from that accident. And it was, don't get me wrong, it's not that it was easy. I definitely had many days of feeling really down because it was just, I was in a lot of pain. So that was something I had to really overcome and just accept. But I had a baby in my belly, and that was what motivated me. And I thought, I just want to do everything I can for that child. So recovering from the accident was truly, it took everything. I devoted this. So when I had the accident, I was 14 weeks pregnant. So I had about 6 months to deal with getting well enough to be able to deliver this baby. And I did actually improve more when I look back, because I did keep a journal and I have a certain idea about, what I was doing at certain times during that whole period. And, at first I couldn't even lift my arms. I had broken all the ribs on the right side of my body. So it was really hard for me to lift my right arm, especially, but even just to do anything for myself was very challenging to begin with. So I made a pretty rapid recovery. But when I left the hospital after 6 weeks, because I was in a recovery hospital for about 3.5 weeks, I didn't even think I would be able to run again. I didn't know if I'd be able to run again. I was in a wheelchair when I left. My husband actually had to build a wheelchair ramp at our house in the mountains so that I could even get into the house. And so for the first, few weeks, I was pretty incapacitated. But as soon as I got home, I started just gradually trying to walk a little bit more each day, do a little bit more each day. And pretty soon I was out, walking outside. It was in the middle of winter by the time I was really recovered, and I was out snowshoeing in our fields outside our house because we were up pretty high and we had a lot of open space around us. So I was out snowshoeing. I was out doing a lot more activity than I even anticipated I'd be able to do. And when I delivered her, at this point I thought, well, maybe I will be able to run. And even though I had said when I was in the hospital, if I never run again, as long as I deliver a healthy baby, I will be happy. Yeah, that wasn't quite true. My competitive, driven nature just, came barreling right through again. And once I realized I could run, I wanted to start running again. The idea of racing was still a little bit not quite in the forefront of my mind. But once I felt a little bit capable, and I think she was probably 2 or 3 months old, and I'm out running and I'm thinking, maybe I can do a race. So my husband and I had done this race up in the mountains before she was born. It was probably a year or two before we had done it. And I said to my husband, I want to do that fast track challenge again. And he looked at me like, are you sure? And I said, yes, I'm sure. And she was only about 6 months old when I wanted to do this race. And he agreed, and we went to this race, and he was not going to run. He was just going to have the baby while I was running. But I was able to finish this race. And sure, it was slower than the first time I did it. But, I had just had this baby. I had just been through this car accident. And it still kind of boggles my mind that this is where I went. But this is where my mind went. I finished this race and I think, well, I could do that. That means I can do Pikes Peak again. So I immediately went to that place because that is part of, I think, my mindset. If I can do this, then I want to do something more or something bigger. And at the time, that was just how I was wired. And part of it was that Pikes Peak just meant a lot to me. So I had this idea that I could do it again. I wanted to see if I could do it again. And part of that was to prove to myself that even though this accident changed me at some level, I still had that feeling that I wanted to be the competitive athlete that I was before. And I didn't know, and I honestly didn't think I would be as competitive, but I just wanted to see what I could do. And part of that was just trying to get my body back. After having the car accident, and for anyone who's had a baby, your body is different. And I just wanted to see how close I could get to where I had been before, knowing that I had a lot of limitations and challenges. So it just became something that was a goal and a way that I could kind of, I think, experience running the way I loved, the way I like to run, and also maybe prove to myself that this accident was just not going to fully take away what I loved. And that was part of my motivation. Even though I was broken in a severe way, I wasn't so broken that I couldn't do what I love. So I just took it on as a challenge. And I came back with a vengeance. I did want to have another child. So I put off Pikes Peak for a little while until the second child was born. And then I said to my husband, I'm going to run Pikes Peak again. And he said, okay. The one thing about Brian, he's always willing to support me no matter what crazy kind of stuff I want to do. So he never argued with me. He never said, well, I don't think that's a good idea. He said, okay, if that's what you want to do. And so sure enough, when Jesse was 1, that's the second child, I went back to Pikes Peak and I continued to race Pikes Peak for another 8 or 9 years. And Pikes Peak was the race that motivated me, and I think part of it was that it was kind of a grounding place for me. If I could run Pikes Peak, in my mind, that meant I was strong. It meant I was healthy. It meant I was me. And for me, it was kind of part of my identity. So at the time, I just thought I had to do that to find myself. And I don't know, I'm not saying that was healthy or even smart, but it was how I identified myself. So it was what I gravitated towards. And it was very motivating. If you want to train for a Pikes Peak, you have to get out in the mountains. You have to get up to high altitude. You have to do those mountain runs. And that's what I love to do anyway. So having Pikes Peak on the horizon was always a way of, okay, every summer I'm going to go out and train. And I think maybe part of it was, I thought if I wasn't training for Pikes Peak, would I do all those things that were necessary to get to that start line? Would I do it regardless of whether I was racing or not? And knowing myself now and having the confidence I do now, I know that I would have done it anyway. But at the time, I needed that race on the horizon to prove to myself, or to have those intermediate goals so that I would get out the door and do what it took to get to the start line. Even though probably now I can look back and say, well, Vicki, you didn't really need to race to do that. But at the time, that's what I needed. And it was somewhat of an emotional crutch, I think, because I didn't trust myself enough to just say, oh, you're going to do it anyway. You'll go out and run in the mountains, even if you're not racing. But that was just what I needed. So I find when I'm out for a run and everything is flowing and I feel like my body is doing just what it knows how to do, I find true joy. I mean, it's just the best feeling in the world. And I think it comes back to this injury I'm dealing with right now. It is literally the case that my body, even though I want to run, my brain is saying every time I go to take a step in the last 2 weeks, my brain is saying, no, like, don't do it. Don't take that step because it's not going to flow. So when my body is kind of all working in the way it's supposed to, running is true joy for me. But I am now at a place where if I have to hobble through a run, there is no peace in that. So when my body's working and when everything is at ease, I do find real peace, and it's a meditative, kind of very calming experience. And I also find it when I'm running well, and then I can race and get into that flow state, which is also sometimes elusive, right? I think anyone who's raced numerous times, you kind of know what it feels like to be in the flow versus kind of it being forced. So I'm now in a place, I think, where I know what it's like to be in the flow state. So when I can get there, and whether I'm running slow or fast, you can find that flow state. It's where everything is just kind of moving the way it's supposed to. And foundation training, by the way, is a way to really find that beauty of how the body's supposed to move. So even though I might right now in these 2 weeks of being injured, I haven't been able to find it in running, I can find it when I'm doing foundation training. I can find it in the pool. And I'm just still seeking it out. I don't know that there's any like end point you get to where it's like, oh, you've reached that place and you're done. I just don't think that's how it works. I think we're kind of constantly seeking out. And that's the beauty of, I think why we come back to running is that when you do feel that just ease of that run, that just feels like, wow, that was such a great run. It felt so good. It felt so easy. We don't have that every run, and we're not going to have it every day, but even in our lives, right? But the fact that we can have it, or we have had it, I think is motivation enough to keep trying to find it again.
I feel that. Regardless of age or speed, we can still find those moments when everything is flowing well, and running is just a pure joy. It feels magical. Running pain-free, feeling healthy and strong, it is a worthy goal to keep at for a lifetime. And that does bring us to the end of Vicki Hunter's running story on the podcast. Thank you so much, Vicki, for sharing your story, bringing your wisdom and your experience and the insights that you have gained through the many years that you have been involved in this sport. I know I, for one, resonate with so much of what Vicki said. There's actually a lot of crossover between my athlete story and her athlete story. So yeah, I really appreciate her coming on the podcast and telling this whole story. And as a reminder, if you would like to hear more context around Vicki's life and experiences, you can read her new memoir, Running and Returning, Seeking Balance in an Imperfect World. Look to the show notes for links to how you can find the book and all the ways that you can keep up with Vicki Hunter. I will also have a link to how you can find the podcast Unexpected Curves, which I know you will love. That is going to do it for me for this episode. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of Women's Running Stories. And until next Tuesday, I do wish you healthy, joyful, pain-free strides forward. Women's Running. Women's Running Stories.
Running should be simple. Just put on your shoes and go. And yet, when you try to learn about how to get better at it, especially as you age, you're confronted with conflicting advice, complicated workouts, and confusing nutrition trends that just won't work for you. On The Planted Runner, I'll share exactly how to run faster, longer, and feel great doing it at any age because you don't have time to waste. I'm Coach Claire Bartholic, and I went from not running at all in my late 30s to finishing a marathon in 2:58 at age 42, all on a plant-based diet. I've helped hundreds of runners achieve new personal records well into their 60s and even 70s with science-backed training, plant-based nutrition, and proven mental strength techniques. Each episode of The Planted Runner is like a private coaching session on the run, where you'll learn from me and the guests I interview. You'll get actionable lessons to help you become a better runner every week and reach goals you never thought possible. Whether you're training for your first 5K or your 50th marathon, take along The Planted Runner on your next run. Let me show you how your best running is still ahead of you.